There were 7 rubber mats stacked against the back wall of a loading dock on East 26th Street in Tacoma, Washington. Not foam, not the thin dollar store kind. Thick, black, anti-fatigue mats, the kind that used to line the floor behind a restaurant prep station, cut in 3-foot by 2-foot sections, heavy enough that each one took both arms to carry. They had been sitting there for at least 2 weeks. Wren Calloway had walked past them 4 times before she stopped. She was 24. She had been living at the SR 509 overpass camp for about 3 months by then, a stretch of gravel and broken concrete wedged between the sound barrier wall and the on-ramp to the port district. The camp had maybe 30 people on a good week, less when the weather ran people east toward the shelters in downtown Tacoma. Wren stayed. She had reasons. The mats were heavy. That was the first thing she registered when she crouched down and pressed her palm into one. Dense, not spongy the way foam goes soft after a season of weather. This was closer to solid rubber, maybe a 1/4 inch of give before it pushed back. She turned one over. The underside had a waffle pattern pressed into it, little hollow squares in a grid about the size of a thumbnail each. She counted a row, 14 across. She pressed the surface again, harder this time. It held. Nobody had taken them. That told her something. In a camp like the one under SR 509, anything with a use gets used within a day. A tarp finds someone's tent by sundown. A broken folding chair becomes a step, a shelf, a windbreak. Cardboard, everyone knows what to do with cardboard. But these mats had sat there for 2 weeks on a public loading dock, and nobody had moved them. Either no one could see the use, or the weight made it not worth figuring out. There 7 mats, probably 12 to 15 pounds each. You'd need a cart or a very specific idea of what you were going to do with them. Wren had a cart. She had found it 3 weeks earlier in a strip mall parking lot. A wire shelf cart with one bent wheel that pulled slightly left. She had been using it to move water jugs from the gas station on Pacific Avenue. She went back to the camp that afternoon, got the cart, and went back to the loading dock. She took all 7. The structure she was living in at that point was what most people at the camp called a wrap, a large blue polyethylene tarp stretched over a frame of rebar stakes, secured at the corners with bungee cords and zip ties. The edges weighted down with rocks along the bottom. It was about 8 feet wide and 11 feet long, roughly. She had been in it since early November, and the problem with it was the same problem every tarp shelter in that camp had. It kept rain out. It did almost nothing for cold. Tacoma in November runs cold at night in a specific way. It is not the dramatic cold of eastern Washington, not the kind that announces itself. It is wet cold, the kind that comes in sideways off the sound and finds every gap. A tarp blocks rain, but the walls of a tarp shelter are a single layer of plastic. There is nothing between you and that air except whatever you are wearing or whatever you have piled on top of you. The cold does not get blocked. It just slows down for a moment and then comes through. Wren had a sleeping bag, a synthetic fill bag rated to 20 degrees, and she had been using it with a wool blanket on top. On the worst nights, that was almost enough. Almost. There is a specific feeling of waking up at 3 in the morning and realizing you have been asleep for 2 hours, and you are still cold, still not warm enough to sleep deeply. Your body running just enough energy to keep the chill from becoming dangerous, but not enough to let you rest. If you have ever slept in a space where the wall gives nothing back, just takes you know what that feels like. The mats changed that. Not immediately. Wren did not come back to the camp with the 7 mats and immediately know what she was doing. She spent 2 days working it out, and the first version was wrong. Her first idea was to lay them on the ground. This made sense as a starting point. Foam mats as sleeping pads, the use everyone knows, and she laid 3 of them flat on the ground inside her tarp, side by side, and slept on top of them the first night. Warmer on the bottom, not enough. The ground cold matters, and she had made progress on the ground cold. But the cold that was waking her up was not coming from below. It was lateral. It was coming through the tarp walls. She lay there that first night thinking about it, and she thought about the waffle pattern on the underside of the mats, those hollow squares. What those squares were doing was trapping air. The waffle grid was not just texture. It was the structure that created dead air pockets between the mat and whatever surface it sat against. Dead air does not conduct heat the way solid material does. That is what those commercial mats are actually engineered to do. They are not just cushioning for someone standing at a prep station for 6 hours. They are insulation from the cold floor below. The waffle side traps air. The dense rubber above it slows conduction. She had been using the insulation on the wrong surface. The second version took most of the next day. She unclipped the tarp on one long side, pulled it back and started lashing the mats to the rebar frame vertically, standing them upright like wall panels. The rebar stakes were thin, not structural in the way a stud wall is structural, so she used a combination of zip ties and paracord she had been given by someone at the camp. She ran the paracord through the waffle holes on the back of the mat and tied it off to the rebar at 3 points per mat: top, middle, bottom. Each mat overlapped the next by about 2 inches on either side. She did the full long wall first. That was the south-facing wall, the one that took wind off the port, 3 mats wide. Then she did the short east wall, 2 mats, with a gap at the top where the tarp roof came down. She left the west wall open. That was the entry side, where she had the tarp folded back as a door flap. The 4th wall north was already against the concrete sound barrier. She left that alone. When she pulled the blue tarp back down over the frame, the shelter looked almost the same from the outside. Slightly wider at the walls because of the thickness of the mats, but not dramatically. What was different was what you felt when you stepped inside. She stayed outside for an hour that evening until the temperature dropped. Then she went in. The difference was not subtle. Inside the shelter, with the tarp door folded shut, the air held in a way it had not held before. Not warm, not yet. She had not been inside long enough to heat the space, but contained. The lateral cold that had been bleeding through the plastic walls on 2 sides was slowed down. The rubber mats were doing the same thing against the tarp walls that they had done against the restaurant floor. The waffle pattern on the back created a dead air gap between the mat and the tarp. The dense rubber facing inward slowed the transfer. The shelter was still cold when she went in. Within 20 minutes, with her body heat, the interior temperature was noticeably higher than outside. She slept through the night, not because she had a better sleeping bag, not because she had added more blankets. She slept through because the walls were holding what her body was putting into the space. Before the mats, she was heating the interior of the shelter, and the cold walls were taking it back out immediately. That thermal exchange, over and over all night, that is why she kept waking up. The walls were drawing heat away from the air faster than her body could replace it. With the mats up, that exchange slowed down enough that the space could actually warm and stay warm. She told this to a woman named Priya, who had been at the camp about a month longer than Ren, and was living in a dome tent with a broken zipper she had fixed with safety pins. Priya listened, and then said something that Ren thought about for a long time after. She said, "I thought those mats were just for the floor. That is what everyone thought. That is what they are sold as. Anti-fatigue flooring, commercial kitchen flooring, standing mat. The entire category exists in a commercial context: restaurants, warehouses, industrial kitchens, and all the knowledge about what they actually do thermally is written for facilities managers and purchasing departments, not for a 24-year-old sleeping under an overpass in Tacoma. The product is everywhere. The knowledge of its full behavior is aimed at a completely different audience." Ren figured it out herself by lying on her back at 3 a.m, thinking about waffle patterns. After Priya, 2 more people asked her about it. One of them was a man she knew only as Marcus, mid-40s, quiet, lived in a structure at the far north end of the camp that he had built from salvaged pallet wood. His structure was the most solid thing in the camp, better than most, but it had gaps between the pallet slats, and the wind came through those gaps in a way he could not entirely solve. Ren told him what she had done. He listened carefully and said nothing for a while. Then he asked if she had any extra mats. She had 2 left. She had used 5 for the walls, and the 3 ground mats she had removed from the floor and restacked outside. She gave him 1. He cut it into strips with a box cutter and used it to stuff the gaps between his pallet slats, the waffle side facing inward. He told her 2 days later it had made a real difference. The second person was a woman in her early 30s who had arrived at the camp within the past week. Ren did not know her name yet. She had a small orange backpacking tent, the ultralight kind, not built for sustained winter use, more of a 3-season shelter that had been pushed into a 4th season it was not designed for. At night, the tent walls were pooling condensation on the inside, which was then dripping back down and dampening her sleeping bag. She had the tent set up directly on gravel. Ren looked at it and told her the 2 things she needed to do: get something between the floor and the ground, and find a way to break the contact between the tent wall and the cold outside air. She did not have extra mats to offer, but she told her what to look for: weight, density, the waffle pattern on the back. The woman wrote the address of the loading dock on her hand. The mats were gone by the time she got there, but she found something similar, a roll of rubber-backed carpet padding behind a furniture store, 2 blocks east. Different material, similar principle. She cut it into sections and lined 2 interior walls of her tent, holding the sections up with duct tape and clothespins. It was not as good as the rubber mats. It was considerably better than nothing. This is the part that is hard to explain about the camp, the way information moves through it. It is not organized. There is no one telling people what works and what does not. Knowledge travels person to person based on who happened to be standing nearby when something was figured out, based on who asked and who was willing to talk. A lot of what gets figured out at a camp like the one under SR 509 never leaves the camp. It does not get written down. It does not get posted anywhere. It exists as long as the person who figured it out is still there, and then it is gone. Wren was not thinking about any of that when she carried the mats back from the loading dock on the cart with the bent wheel. She was thinking about whether the rebar was strong enough to hold them vertically, and whether the zip tie she had would be the right gauge, and whether she needed to pick up more paracord first. She was solving a specific problem. The rubber mats on the loading dock were a specific answer that happened to be heavy enough that nobody else had thought to pick them up. By the time December came, her shelter was the warmest structure in that section of the camp. Not because she had more equipment than anyone else. She did not. The sleeping bag was a 20-degree synthetic that was starting to lose some loft on the left side. The tarp was the same blue polyethylene she had started with. The rebar frame was the same. The 5 mats on the walls weighed about 60 pounds total and had been free. What she had done was understand what the walls were doing wrong and then change it. Other people in that camp were sleeping under more blankets, more layers, more gear. Some of them had 0-degree bags. Some had sleeping pads that cost real money when they were new. None of them were warmer than Wren. The insulation she needed was not between her body and her sleeping bag. It was between the inside of the shelter and the outside air. Every BTU her body generated was immediately donated to the night the moment it touched those plastic tarp walls. The mats stopped the donation. You can test this yourself if you want to understand it. Find a room with a cold exterior wall. Stand near it on a cold night. Feel the air temperature right at the wall compared to the air temperature in the center of the room. The difference, depending on how cold it is outside and how well insulated that wall is, can be dramatic. Now imagine that wall is a single layer of polyethylene plastic and you are sleeping 3 feet from it. That is what a tarp shelter without wall insulation is doing to you all night. You are not sleeping in a room. You are sleeping directly adjacent to the outside temperature, separated only by a surface thin enough to see light through. Wren's shelter now had walls, not walls in the construction sense, not framing and drywall and fiberglass bats, but walls in the functional sense, surfaces that slowed the exchange. That was enough. She stayed at the SR 509 camp through February. In January, there was a week of temperatures that dropped into the upper 20s at night. 3 people in the camp went to the emergency shelter downtown for those nights. Wren stayed. She said later that those nights were cold. She was not pretending otherwise, but that she slept. The kind of sleep where you wake up and it is morning, and there is not the particular exhaustion that comes from a body that has been fighting cold for 8 hours without rest. Marcus stayed too, and the woman with the orange tent. And Priya eventually switched to a setup similar to Wren's after her tent zipper gave out entirely, where she found a cache of thin rubber drawer liner, not as thick, not as heavy, but the same basic principle, and layered it 4 strips deep on the 2 walls that took the most wind. It was not as good as the restaurant mats. It worked. This is the thing about rubber mats in a commercial kitchen. They exist in large quantities. They are heavy enough that they often get left behind when businesses close or renovate. They are nearly indestructible, and they are never marketed to the person who might need them most. The knowledge that they work as wall insulation in a small shelter is not a secret. It is just not information aimed at anyone sleeping under a Tacoma overpass. No one wrote a guide for that. No facilities manager circulated a memo. The gap is not a conspiracy. It is just a category problem. The product is commercial. The knowledge is commercial. The people who need it most are outside that category entirely. Wren walked into the gap anyway. She was not an engineer. She had not studied thermodynamics. She had worked before she lost her apartment on Yakima Avenue as a line cook at a Thai restaurant in the Proctor district, which is, she noted later, was something that was not quite irony and not quite satisfaction. exactly the kind of place that had those rubber mats on the floor behind the prep station. She had stood on them. She had never thought about what they were actually doing until she was lying on her back at 3 in the morning under an overpass in November, listening to the wind come off the port, running out of warmth, and trying to figure out why. The cart with the bent wheel is still at the camp. She left it when she moved on in March. The details of where and how are hers, not part of this story. What she left at the camp was the cart, and the knowledge and the 5 mats on the wall of what became, for a little while, a different kind of shelter than anyone under that overpass had built before. What she figured out came from standing on it for 2 years before she ever needed it. That is where it came from. Not a guide, not research, or a prep station in the Proctor district. And a night in November when she ran out of other options and looked at what was already around her and started thinking.